On a quiet evening in rural Montana, as the last rays of daylight stretched across the winding road, Daniel Johnson's pickup truck hummed gently, bringing him home from a long day at the veterinary clinic. What began as an ordinary drive soon turned into something extraordinary when Daniel discovered an orphaned Canada Lynx kitten, barely clinging to life next to its mother's body. But it wasn't Daniel who would form the strongest connection with the wild creature. It was Buddy, their golden retriever, who seemed to understand the kitten's need. This unlikely friendship would soon defy all expectations. Before we start, make sure to subscribe the channel and hit the like button. Also hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the winding country road as Daniel Johnson drove his pickup truck home after a long day at the veterinary clinic. The October air carried a distinct chill, one that hinted at the fast-approaching winter in rural Montana. The maple trees lining the road had erupted into a fiery canopy of orange and red, their leaves rustling in the breeze like crackling embers. Daniel was looking forward to a quiet evening at home with his wife, Sarah, and their 12-year-old daughter, Emma. Life on their 60-acre property outside of Whitefish provided the peace and connection to nature that the family cherished, especially after Daniel's hectic days treating the livestock of local farmers and ranchers. As he rounded a bend roughly 2 miles from home, something small and dark caught his eye on the shoulder of the road. Most drivers might have passed without a second glance, but 2 decades as a veterinarian had trained Daniel to notice animals even at a distance. He eased off the gas, pulled the truck over, and climbed out. What he saw made his heart sink. A female Canada lynx lay motionless in the gravel, clearly the victim of a collision. Daniel had seen enough wildlife casualties to know she hadn't been dead long, perhaps only a few hours. He was turning back toward his truck, intent on calling the local wildlife authorities, when a faint sound stopped him. A soft, high-pitched mewling. At first, he thought the lynx might still be alive, but as he knelt closer, he realized the sound was coming from the nearby tall grass just off the shoulder. Pushing through the dry autumn leaves, he found the source, a tiny Canada Lynx kitten, no more than 2 weeks old, huddled into a tight, shivering ball. Its spotted fur blended so perfectly with the ground cover that it was a miracle Daniel had seen it at all. "Oh, little one," he murmured, his trained eyes quickly assessing the kitten's condition. Severely dehydrated and likely unfed since its mother's death, the lynx was barely hanging on. That it had survived this long alone was nothing short of miraculous. Daniel knew the odds of an orphaned wild kitten surviving were slim, especially with winter looming. The region's wildlife rehabilitation centers were already underfunded and overcrowded. In that moment, he made a decision, one he knew might be controversial, but felt right. He gently scooped up the kitten, too weak to resist, and tucked it inside his jacket for warmth. "Let's get you home, little guy," he whispered, taking one last look at the mother lynx. He would call the Forest Service about her remains once he got home. "I promise I'll do right by you." Daniel James Johnson. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Sarah's voice echoed through the kitchen, tinged with disbelief as she stared at the tiny lynx now resting on a towel atop their counter. "We can't keep a wild Canada lynx. It's illegal without permits. Not to mention dangerous." Daniel was already warming a small bottle of kitten formula to the perfect temperature. I know. But look at him, Sarah. He wouldn't survive the night at the rehab center. They're overwhelmed, still dealing with those 3 orphaned bear cubs from last month's forest fire." Their daughter Emma stood nearby, her wide blue eyes filled with concern and fascination. "Is he going to die, Dad?" "Not if I can help it," Daniel replied, carefully drawing the warm formula into a syringe. "I've treated Canada Lynx kittens at the clinic before. He's weak, dehydrated, and hungry, but otherwise seems healthy." Sarah sighed, her initial resistance softening as she watched her husband feed the kitten with practiced tenderness. After 20 years of marriage to a veterinarian, she was no stranger to animals in need. Their home already housed 3 rescued barn cats, a one-eyed former racehorse named Captain, and their beloved 5-year-old golden retriever Buddy, who was now watching the scene quietly from the doorway, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on the tiny newcomer. "I already called Mike at the Forest Service," Daniel added, referring to his longtime friend and local wildlife conservation officer. "He's bringing over temporary wildlife rehab permits in the morning. If this little guy survives, we'll assess whether he can be released back into the wild." Emma stepped closer, her curiosity now outweighing her fear. "What's his name going to be?" she asked. "Emma," Sarah said cautiously. "We're not keeping him. He's a wild animal." "But he still needs a name while he's here," Emma insisted. "We can't just call him Canada Lynx." Daniel smiled at his daughter's logic. "How about Max?" he suggested. "Short for maximum effort. Because that's exactly what it's going to take to get this little fellow back on his feet." "Max," Emma repeated, nodding. "I think he likes it." As if in response, the kitten let out a small, squeaky noise, curling up on the towel with a soft sigh, its tiny sides rising and falling in sleep. Buddy, who had remained at the doorway, now padded over and stood on his hind legs, placing his front paws gently on the edge of the counter. He sniffed the lynx cautiously. Then, to everyone's surprise, he gave a soft whine and delicately licked the top of Max's head. "Well, would you look at that?" Daniel murmured. "Buddy's already adopted him." Sarah couldn't help but smile, despite her misgivings. "Fine. But this is temporary, Daniel. Very temporary." Neither of them could have guessed how that moment would spark a friendship that defied the boundaries between wild and domestic. One that would span years and bring unexpected joy into their lives. 3 years passed in a steady rhythm of presence and absence. Max had grown into a magnificent adult Canada Lynx, nearly twice the size of Buddy. His powerful limbs and signature short, bobbed tail marked the strength and grace of his species. Though his visits became less frequent, they remained deeply meaningful, especially for Buddy, who greeted his old friend with unchanging joy every time he returned. The Johnson family's respect for Max's wild nature only deepened over time. They never tried to restrain him or treat him like a pet. During his visits, Max was not a domesticated animal but a wild neighbor who had chosen to maintain a connection with them, an arrangement that suited everyone just fine. One crisp November morning, Max made one of his now rare appearances. Daniel had just returned from feeding the horses when he spotted the lynx sitting calmly at the edge of the yard, watching the house with intent. Buddy, now 8 years old and beginning to show gray around his muzzle, sensed his friend immediately and rushed outside, tail wagging furiously. The two animals greeted each other with familiar affection, Buddy bowing playfully, and Max gently batting at his ear. Daniel called for Sarah and Emma, knowing how much these reunions meant to them. "He looks different somehow," Emma observed from the porch. Now 15, she had developed her father's sharp eye for animal behavior. Daniel nodded. He'd noticed the same thing. Max seemed more restless than usual, pacing a few steps toward the forest, then turning back to Buddy, repeating the motion with growing urgency. "I think he wants Buddy to follow him," Sarah said, voicing the thought they were all beginning to share. Daniel hesitated. Max had never shown aggression toward them, but he was still a wild predator. Instincts could shift without warning. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Dad, look at Buddy," Emma said softly. Buddy stood at the edge of the yard, gazing back at them with pleading eyes, clearly eager to follow Max. After a brief family conference, they agreed to follow at a safe distance. Daniel grabbed his veterinary bag, just in case, and they set off behind the unusual pair. Max led them deeper into the forest than they had ever ventured before, far beyond their usual walking trails and into a dense, shadowed section of the woods bordering the national forest. "He's taking us somewhere specific," Daniel remarked as Max paused now and then, looking back to make sure they were still following. After about 20 minutes, Max disappeared into a small clearing, partially sheltered by a fallen log and thick underbrush. Buddy followed without hesitation. When the family stepped into the clearing, they were met with an astonishing sight. Nestled in a well-concealed den beneath the log were 3 tiny Canada Lynx kittens. Their blue-gray eyes and spotted fur marked them as only a few weeks old. Max stood protectively nearby, watching carefully but making no move to stop the family's approach. "He's a father," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. "He's brought us to meet his family." What happened next moved them all to tears. Buddy approached the kittens with astonishing gentleness, lying down beside the den. One by one, Max nudged the tiny lynxes toward the golden retriever. The curious kittens toddled over to Buddy, who began to carefully lick and groom them as if they were his own. "It's like he's introducing his children to their uncle," Emma said softly. Or asking his old friend to help protect them, Daniel added, already assessing the health of the kittens with a trained eye. I don't see any sign of a mother. I wonder if something happened to her. As if in response, Max moved closer and lay beside Buddy and the kittens, his posture relaxed, almost vulnerable. It was a gesture of deep trust and quiet desperation. Daniel, Sarah said gently, I think he's brought them to us for help. And in that moment, they all understood the profound bond they had formed with Max. He wasn't just visiting. He was turning to the only family he had ever known. The weeks that followed were both heartwarming and challenging, as the Johnsons worked tirelessly to support Max and his growing family. As Daniel had suspected, the mother lynx was indeed gone, leaving Max to care for the 3 fragile kittens. The family's primary concern now was to ensure the kittens thrived in the wild while maintaining the necessary distance to prevent human dependence. Daniel and Sarah coordinated daily visits, always mindful not to interfere too much. They'd constructed a small feeding station near the den, stocked with fresh meat and water, and ensured the kittens were in good health. The small station was shielded by surrounding trees and brush, giving them privacy as they checked on the little lynxes, making sure not to disrupt their natural behaviors. Every time they approached the den, Max was always nearby, his eyes sharp and attentive. He had become not just a father, but a protector in every sense. Buddy, their 5-year-old golden retriever, who had once seemed so different from the wild lynx, had become an integral part of the family's daily rhythm. His attachment to Max and the kittens had deepened, and Buddy now served as an unlikely co-parent. He would accompany the family on every visit, sometimes lounging lazily by the den, other times playing joyfully with the young lynxes. He had taken it upon himself to teach the kittens how to play, grooming them with loving care. His gentle nature and unwavering patience had a calming effect on the wild creatures, who grew more comfortable around him every day. As the days turned to weeks, the kittens' strength and curiosity grew. They had begun to wander further from the den under Max's watchful gaze, slowly becoming familiar with the world around them. Max taught them how to hunt small prey, his eyes constantly assessing the surroundings for danger while Buddy kept a protective eye on the kittens from a distance. There was a harmony to the odd family dynamic, a delicate balance of wild instinct and domestic care. The unusual family unit soon drew the attention of wildlife biologists, who came from far and wide to observe the rare bond between the wild lynx, his offspring, and the domesticated dog. Dr. Ella Harper, a feline conservation specialist from the University of Montana, was particularly moved by what she saw. In all my years studying wild felids, Dr. Harper said with awe in her voice, I've never seen anything like this. It challenges everything we think we know about wildlife rehabilitation and cross-species relationships. There is something deeply profound happening here. This is a reminder that nature's capacity for connection is far greater than we often give it credit for. With the arrival of winter, the forest transformed into a glittering white landscape. The snow settled over the forest floor, and the trees stood bare, their limbs heavy with frost. The kittens, now more agile, began to test their hunting skills in earnest, often returning to the den with small game, their bodies lean and strong from the cold. Max's pride was evident in every movement as he watched over them, his eyes glinting with approval. Buddy, too, was a constant presence, now almost an honorary member of the lynx family, continuing to watch over his wild companions with quiet devotion. The dynamic between Max, Buddy, and the kittens had changed their lives in ways the Johnsons could never have anticipated. What began as an improbable rescue mission had turned into something far more meaningful, a testament to the unpredictable and powerful bonds that could form between species. The Johnsons had been witness to a quiet miracle, one that reaffirmed their belief in the deep and often mysterious connections that define life in the wild. One snowy afternoon, Emma approached her parents with an idea. I want to set up a wildlife camera near the feeding station, she said, for my science project on interspecies relationships. I want to see what happens when we're not there. The footage retrieved a week later left the family speechless. In the quiet moments when humans were absent, Max and Buddy were captured engaging in playful behaviors rarely seen between wild and domestic animals. The golden retriever would initiate games of chase, while Max demonstrated hunting techniques, sometimes to his kittens, but curiously, also to Buddy. In one remarkable sequence, the two worked together to herd the kittens back toward the den as a coyote passed nearby. Their co-parenting, Sarah said in amazement as they reviewed the footage. "They're raising those kittens together." As winter gave way to spring, the reality of another transition began to weigh on the family, especially Emma. The Canada Lynx kittens, now nearly 6 months old, were growing more independent. Their need for supplemental feeding had decreased, and Max had begun taking them on longer excursions away from the den. "They'll be leaving soon, won't they?" Emma asked her father one April evening as they made their daily trek into the woods to check on the Lynx family. Daniel nodded, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "That's the natural order of things, sweetheart. Young Canada Lynx leave to establish their own territories." "Will we ever see them again?" "Max came back," Daniel reminded her. "And we've given his kittens a positive connection to this place, without making them dependent. That's the best gift we could offer them. A wild life, with a safe harbor if they ever need it." By early summer, the den was empty. The feeding station sat untouched. The Canada Lynx family had moved on. Even Buddy seemed to understand. During their walks, he no longer pulled toward the old clearing. Instead, he resumed his regular routines on the farm. Yet, every so often, he would stand quietly at the edge of the yard, gazing into the trees, as if waiting. 2 years passed. Buddy, now 10, had slowed considerably. His muzzle was fully gray, and arthritis in his hips had dulled the boundless energy that once carried him through the woods. Daniel had started him on medication that eased his pain, but the golden days of forest romps were behind him. Max's visits had grown rare. Brief appearances every few months, just long enough to nuzzle Buddy, lounge beside him, and then melt back into the trees. The Johnsons treasured these moments, each one a sign that their approach to raising the orphaned lynx had worked. Max had become a wild animal, yet one who never forgot his roots. It was the first snowfall of November when Emma, home from her first semester at Montana State University where she was studying wildlife biology, noticed Buddy acting strangely. The old dog stood at the kitchen door, whining persistently, despite having just been outside. "What is it, boy?" she asked, opening the door once more. Buddy trotted into the fresh snow, pausing to look back at her. Curious, Emma pulled on her coat and followed. He led her to the edge of the yard, then stopped, his gaze fixed on the tree line. There, just visible in the swirling snow, stood a familiar silhouette. "Dad, Mom." Emma called toward the house. "It's Max." The Canada Lynx stepped from the forest, his tawny coat vivid against the white. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, nearly full-grown, came one of his offspring, instantly recognizable by a distinctive pattern of spots above its right eye, which Daniel had noted in his journal years earlier. As the family watched from the porch, Max approached Buddy with the same gentle familiarity they had seen so many times before. Then, remarkably, he stepped aside, as if inviting his grown child to do the same. After a moment's hesitation, the younger lynx cautiously moved forward. Buddy remained still, tail wagging gently in welcome. "He's introducing his grown child to Buddy," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He remembered. In the hush of that snowy afternoon, the Johnsons stood together, watching a living legacy unfold, a connection born of trust, nurtured through kindness, and carried forward by the wild. In the years that followed, Max continued to visit. Sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by the same grown offspring, his silent presence like a ghost of the forest, but with warmth rather than menace. The Johnsons began to believe this was his way of maintaining a bond, not just with Buddy, but with the family that had once saved his life. These visits were never predictable. He might arrive during the orange twilight of autumn or the hushed white of January's snow. Each appearance was a reminder that nature remembers, and so does the heart of a wild creature. Buddy, now nearly 13, had become a slower version of his once spry self. His golden fur had grayed around the muzzle. His tail wagged more slowly, and his once joyful leaps were now stiff, measured steps. During particularly harsh winters, he could no longer handle long walks or romp through the deep snow. The Johnsons prepared themselves for the inevitable, keeping him as comfortable as they could. Then one morning, as snow dusted the farmhouse roof and frost curled around the windows, Emma glanced up from her tea and gasped. Max was sitting at the window, calm, watchful, and unmistakable. He didn't pace. He didn't growl. He tapped once, gently, with his paw against the glass, then sat still. They had always kept the boundary between domestic and wild sacred. But in that moment, they all understood something had changed. This was not the wild lynx of the forest, but a lifelong companion making a request. With careful judgment and quiet reverence, Daniel led him inside. Max padded through the house like he had always belonged, until he reached Buddy, who lay curled in a soft bed near the fireplace. The two looked at each other for a moment before Max lay down beside him. Their heads touched. They didn't play. They didn't move. They simply rested, an aging dog and a wild lynx bound by something deeper than instinct. This continued for days. Max came and went, staying just long enough to be with Buddy during the quiet hours. And when Buddy finally passed, peacefully and without pain, it was as if Max already knew. He didn't return for several days. They buried Buddy on a quiet knoll overlooking the forest, a place where he had once stood, gazing into the trees, waiting. Daniel was the only one who looked up from the small, private ceremony and saw Max, just barely visible between the snow-covered branches, standing sentinel. Silent. Still. He didn't need to come any closer. His presence was enough. A week after Buddy's burial, the Johnson farm returned to its familiar rhythms. Daniel rose early each day, feeding the horses and ensuring the barns were secure against the growing cold. Emma resumed her studies, quietly distracted, her thoughts often wandering back to the moments she had shared with Buddy. Even Scout, the energetic new golden retriever puppy, seemed to sense the lingering sorrow. Though he was still learning the joyful art of puppyhood, bounding across the yard and attempting to catch his tail, there was a quietness to him now, a stillness that occasionally pulled him to Buddy's empty bed, where he lay and stared at the worn spot as if he, too, was processing a loss too big to understand. The house itself seemed to mourn. Sarah could feel it most acutely when she worked in the kitchen. The silence in the house punctuated only by the soft creak of the floorboards or the hum of the stove. The usual chaos, Emma's laughter, Buddy's gentle snoring in his favorite spot, the bustling noise of a house full of animals, had dissipated, replaced by an eerie, contemplative quiet. It was a silence Sarah didn't know how to fill. One afternoon, feeling the weight of the quiet around her, Sarah decided to walk to the knoll where Buddy had been buried. She had always found solace in the quiet space beneath the trees, and today, she needed the comfort of nature. With a small wooden ornament in her hands, carved by Emma in memory of Buddy, Sarah made her way across the farm to the small hill that overlooked the vast, snow-covered wilderness beyond. It had been Emma's idea, a symbol of remembrance, a simple token, yet one that seemed to encapsulate everything Buddy had been to them. But when Sarah arrived at the knoll, she stopped short. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked down at the base of Buddy's headstone. There, placed with deliberate care at the foot of the grave, was a freshly killed rabbit. Its body was intact, no claw marks or bites to suggest a brutal kill. The animal had been caught, handled, and placed with the utmost care, a sign of respect that sent a chill through Sarah's spine. The rabbit's fur was still soft, and the body was positioned as if it had been gently placed there, not tossed or abandoned. As she knelt to examine the offering, Sarah's eyes wandered to the earth beside the rabbit. There, clear in the soft soil, was a large paw print, a round, distinct impression that was unmistakably the mark of a Canada lynx. A lynx paw print, one she had seen before many times, when Max had visited their yard over the years. Tears immediately welled in Sarah's eyes. This was no random act of nature. This was something deeply intentional, a message, a gesture that could only come from one animal, the wild, proud lynx they had once raised. Max. He had brought the rabbit to Buddy's grave as a final offering. It wasn't just a gift, it was a farewell, a way for Max to honor the dog who had been his friend, the dog who had shared his world, and who had helped him in ways that words could never describe. Sarah sat quietly for a long moment, her hand resting on the cold earth. The depth of the act stirred something profound within her, a sense of connection between Max and Buddy that transcended species, one that even death couldn't sever. She whispered through her tears, "He brought Buddy a gift, Daniel. A final goodbye." When she returned to the house and shared the discovery with Daniel and Emma, the emotions that had been held back since Buddy's passing came rushing forward. Emma's face crumpled as the realization settled in. She had witnessed Max's bond with Buddy firsthand, had seen the unlikely friendship that had formed between a wild lynx and a domestic dog. Now, seeing Max's tribute to Buddy, Emma understood something deep and unspoken. Max had mourned Buddy. He had remembered the bond they shared, and he had shown it in the purest way he knew. That evening, after Sarah had shared her discovery, they all stood quietly together in the living room, processing what had happened. Max's gesture was more than just an offering of food. It was a symbol of the bond between them, a bond that not even time or death could erase. Buddy had been a bridge between their world and Max's, and Max had shown them that, even in his wildness, he had loved and understood the dog who had once been his companion. Winter set in that year with a quiet that matched the sorrow in their hearts. Snow fell heavily, blanketing the farm in a soft, white silence. Days passed, and Max didn't return for the season, just as they had expected. It was a natural part of the wild. The cycles of life, of separation, of the distance between humans and wild animals. Yet, the family still visited Buddy's grave, telling Scout stories of the golden retriever who had once ruled their home, teaching him about the dog who had bridged two worlds. And yet, Max's presence remained. Not in physical form, but in the rabbit, in the paw print, in the echoes of the wild footsteps through the snow, in the whisper of the trees. And in the way the family spoke of him, of Buddy's legacy, of Max's extraordinary gift, of the connection that had shaped their lives. Max had left something behind, not just for Buddy, but for them. A wild creature's offering, a final act of love, a legacy of trust and friendship that would be carried forward in the stories they told, from one generation of animals to the next. The Johnsons would never forget. Neither would Max. Time moved forward, as it always did. Emma returned to Montana State University and dove headfirst into her studies. Her professors were intrigued by her insights, but more so by the story she eventually chose to tell. For her capstone project in wildlife biology, she created a thesis titled, "Between Fur and Firelight, Interspecies Bonds in Wild Domestic Relationships." It was grounded not in textbooks, but in experience, in observation, in the snow-silent moments when a dog and a lynx learned to trust, and, ultimately, to love. Daniel, too, found his perspective forever altered. As a veterinarian, he had always believed in clinical detachment. But Max and Buddy had taught him a new way, where science did not preclude softness, and instinct could coexist with compassion. He began working more closely with wildlife centers, consulting on cross-species fostering and gentle rehabilitation. His name, once just local, began appearing in regional wildlife journals, always credited as the vet who raised a lynx with a golden retriever. Sarah, ever the quiet observer of their family's journey, began writing a personal memoir, not for publication, but for legacy. She wanted Scout, and the future children Emma dreamed of having one day, to know the truth of what had happened in that farmhouse, in those woods, and around that fire. And the story didn't end. Every few months, usually in early snow or spring's first thaw, the Johnsons spotted a lynx silhouette at the forest's edge. Sometimes it was Max. Other times, the grown offspring with the distinctive eye spots. Once, they thought they saw two. Perhaps Max's grandkids now roaming the valley. They never tried to follow. They simply waved, sometimes left fresh water or a scrap of food, and stood together at the porch in silence. And when snow fell thick across the pines, Daniel sometimes swore he could see the shape of two animals, one wild, one golden, sitting side by side at the forest's edge, just remembering. Perhaps it was only his heart, weaving stories from grief and gratitude. But then again, perhaps not.